Good morning to everyone in Western Canada. You're joining us at 9 o'clock, and good afternoon to everyone in Central and Eastern Canada. And thank you for joining us today. My name is Ratna Omipa. I'm the president of Maitri, and we're delighted to bring you this webinar as part of our monthly offerings from higherimmigrants.ca to our project Allies, which we operate in partnership with McConnell Family Foundation. The focus of Higher Immigrants is bringing good ideas, good promising practices, good tips and tools to employers regardless of where they may be in Canada, so that their capacity to interview, recruit, hire immigrants as an important part of the talent pool in Canada is enhanced. So it is no wonder that today we are joined, in fact, by employers of all sizes and shapes, all sizes and sectors, including, an interesting amount of participation from regulatory bodies as well, and of course immigrant employment counselors and immigrant serving organizations, as well as representatives from federal, provincial, municipal levels and crown corporations. So over 6 provinces have registered, so we're really reaching the nation today. I think I'm not exaggerating when I say if we are to just look at the registrations, this is one of our most popular webinars to date, and no wonder, because we are zoning in on a really, really important aspect of hiring that employers are concerned about. As with all our other webinars, this will be recorded and made available online for those who are unable to join us or would like to go back to some of the content of the webinar and revisit it. So we have a fantastic panel lined up for you. As a first, we will be hearing from Barbara Hall, who is the Chief Commissioner of the Ontario Human Rights Commission. And as you know, as many of you may know and others should know, the Ontario Human Rights Commission has once again taken the lead in developing a new policy, and this time a new policy on removing the Canadian experience barrier. I am particularly happy to welcome Barbara because she is in Vancouver, and this was a bit of a technological challenge, but we all overcame it. Barbara's presentation will be followed by a panel discussion with 2 leading employers from the legal profession, Michael Schaffler of Dentons Canada and the IT sector, Paul Violate of Piffian, and how we go about recruiting talent. We will then ask our panelists to respond to your questions and answers during the Q&A, and we are very committed to ensuring that we can get to as many of your questions as possible. And so we have constructed and reconstructed this webinar in a way to give you lots and lots of time to put your questions on paper. It's not right to say on paper. Put your questions on the screen so we can put them forward. And please don't worry about getting them absolutely right or absolutely correct. This is not an English language test for anyone. Rather, get your ideas and your questions out whichever way you can, and we'll seek to answer them. If not today, later on. So before we dive into our discussion, we thought we'd do a little poll of all the people on the webinar today. Why do employers ask for Canadian experience? We've given you some options. This is a bit of a multiple choice test. Type in the option that you most like, not type in, click in the option that you most like and can relate to, and this will give us sort of an interesting launch pad for our discussion later on. The responses are coming in. Barbara, can you see the responses?
I can. The list of them, yes.
Wonderful. They're fluctuating. That means people more people are pitching in, but clearly there is a top winner to the poll. No, 2 top winners. My goodness, this is like the U.S. election. And what people are saying is that the top reasons why employers ask for Canadian work experience is to determine if the candidate understands the industry landscape, and close on the heels is people saying all of the above. So this sort of gives us some sense of the challenges that we want to address in this webinar. And by the way, audience, if you think of other reasons, type them in. We'd be happy to share them with the audience. So we are now going to hear from Barbara Hall. Now, Barbara is, for many of us, no stranger. She was, of course, the mayor of Toronto for many years and a councillor before that. She's also a lawyer. After she was mayor of Toronto, she was the chief architect of the national strategy on community safety and crime prevention, and now she leads the Ontario Human Rights Commission, whose work in many ways sets the trend for other human rights commissions across the country and internationally. So welcome, Barbara, and again, thank you for waking up with this assignment. So my first question is, what do you mean, or what do people mean by the term Canadian experience?
Well, at the Human Rights Commission, when we use the term in our new policy, we're talking about a rigid rule that people have worked in Canada and therefore have Canadian experience as a requirement for a job. And what we see that as, in that situation, as an arbitrary rule which creates a barrier for skilled newcomers. They come to Canada, clearly they're new, they haven't worked here, and they're not given a chance to prove their qualifications, their skills, because they haven't done this one thing. So we're talking about arbitrary barrier, something that doesn't allow employers to see what people's skills and education are because they haven't worked here.
So Barbara, here's a question for you. I think we all understand that, you know, you're talking about employers who ask for Canadian work experience. In your experience and your review of the landscape, did you find that employers are asking for it, or are they quoting it in other terminology?
Well, some are still asking for it, and we see ads every day, including a lot on the internet. But we also hear that there are lots of situations where it's not included in the ad specifically, but it comes up in the course of questions, or the feeling many people have that because it's not on their resume, the resume is not considered at all.
Okay. So moving on from here to the new policy of the Ontario Human Rights Commission, could you give the audience a quick look or an overview of it and how it relates to the code that governs all of these things in Ontario?
Yes, the Ontario Human Rights Code. A couple of sections that come up in the context of this discussion. Firstly is Section 5 that prohibits discrimination in employment, and also Section 6 that prohibits discrimination regarding membership in trade unions, trade or occupational associations, or self-governing professions. And then the code goes on to talk about direct versus adverse discrimination. And it also, of course, has a number of grounds on which discrimination can be based, and we're looking specifically at those grounds: place of origin, ethnic origin, race, color, ancestry. So it's in the context of those sections of the code and those grounds that we see a rigid requirement for Canadian experience potentially constituting discrimination. In fact, our policy says that if Canadian experience is required in a rigid way, that we will prima facie say that's discrimination unless the employer or the regulatory body is able to justify why they're requiring that. And there are some fairly high requirements to be able to justify that what they're requiring is not related to discrimination, but in fact a real requirement of the job.
So this does raise the bar significantly in Ontario. I wonder if you can describe to us how this new policy will apply to employers in Ontario, A, employers in Ontario, and B, regulatory bodies in Ontario. And if you could provide us with some examples that will help us put some meat on the bones, that would be really helpful.
Well, in our policy, we're saying that employers need to look at what they require in terms of skills and competencies to do the job. And of course, people need employees who are capable of doing the job. But to list those competencies and those skills, those requirements, and then look at people's experience and training and education in terms of their capacity to do the job, and not focus on where they got the experience or got the skills, but in the whole employment interview context to really assess what are the skills and does the person have the competencies. And the same in terms of regulatory bodies. What are the competencies required to be able to meet the requirements of the profession, and set those out and not focus on where the skills were acquired, but whether or not the individual has them. And being flexible in the ways that one tests whether or not they have them. So not having a single way of determining something, but recognizing that because people have their skills and have got them in different places, they may need different ways of establishing that they meet them.
Now, you did mention, Barbara, that your policy recognizes that there may be some circumstances where Canadian experience is justified. Can you embroider this out a little? Under which conditions would you say asking for Canadian experience is justifiable?
Well, in all the time we've been looking at this issue, Ratna, all the various people at the commission, the staff, the commissioners themselves, we have not come up with the situation that legitimized Canadian experience. We accept the possibility that there may be some out there, but we haven't come up with them. There are, so, you know, maybe we'll hear from some of the people on the call today some situations that will justify Canadian experience, but we don't know what that is.
Well, that's a really good, you know, sort of challenge out to everybody. Tell us where you think Canadian work experience is a justifiable requirement for entry into a regulatory profession or access to employment. I do know that in Ontario there are, and I'm sure across the country, there are reg bodies that still ask for it. The numbers have in Ontario come down a little, but still there are a significant number that ask for it. So I think this is an opportunity for all of us to talk about it. My next question is, how the OHRC is not a ministry in the government. So what are the consequences if an employer or regulatory body does not comply with this policy? What happens to them? Do they go to jail?
What happens is that people who are impacted by what they see as a barrier or discrimination have the ability to file an application at the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal. Before they do that, though, hopefully what people will do is say to the employer, this is contrary to the code, and let them know about our policy and what their rights are, and the employer will take a look at that and determine that that they have inappropriately put a barrier in front of this employee and consider them again. But if that doesn't happen, then individuals can go to the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal and make an application, which is sort of the common parlance would be filing a complaint, and which will then go through the process. Firstly, there'll be an attempt to settle it through mediation, but if not, it could go through so that there's a hearing at the tribunal and ultimately remedies ordered, maybe what again we would think of as damages for the individual, but also potentially remedies where the employer or the regulatory body is ordered to put in place policies and procedures that would eliminate that kind of discrimination from how they do their business.
Thank you, Barbara. As I can see, and I don't know if everyone else can see, the chat room is alive and buzzing. In the chat room, my colleague Bonnie Ma has posted a link to the OHRC policy, which I would encourage people to download. So, and there are, as I can see, over 150 people listening into this, which is fantastic. So now we want to turn to real live employers and get their input into this. And our two employers are once again Michael Scheffler from Dentons and Paul Valet from Piffian. So I have two questions for you. First, tell us more about your company and your hiring practices. And then, well, let's do the first one. So first, to Michael, tell us more about your company and your hiring practices.
Well, Ratna, thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today. Dentons, for folks that don't know, is a global law firm. We are relatively new. We used to be in Canada known as Fraser Milner Casgrain, and we entered into a combination earlier this year. We are now in 152 countries across the globe. We have 80 offices and 2,600 lawyers. In Canada, we have 6 offices with just over 500 lawyers. And what should be of interest to the listeners on this webinar is the fact that we have both regulated and non-regulated folks that work for us. So there are, on the regulated side, the lawyers, the paraprofessionals, and CAs as well. And on the non-regulated side, while there are many, there are, of course, legal assistants, there are folks in technology, folks in marketing, folks in finance, and folks in HR. So there's a wide variety, and I'll come back to that later, Ratna, when we get into some of the details, but it's important to have that context.
Okay, so a big employer, national and international, with lots of people and lots of different kind of jobs, both regulated and unregulated. Over to you, Paul. Pythian, tell us what you do and how your hiring practices work.
Okay, so Pythian is a company I co-founded in '97, and what we do is we help our customers manage especially valuable data and systems infrastructure. And I guess a kind of a fun and easy example of that is that Pythian is the company that runs the back end for Grand Theft Auto 5 that launched this week to great fanfare and amazing reception. And so what we do for Rockstar Games with those kinds of launches is we help make sure that the back-end infrastructure for the data back-end is scalable, secure, running well, and recoverable in the event of an emergency, and we're the ones who actually haul our poor, sorry, tired asses out of bed in the middle of the night to recover them in the event that there is an incident. We also serve, the New York Times Corporation, Forbes Media, and outside the media sector, companies in healthcare, finance, online retail, including really a who's who of the world's most valuable data infrastructure. As far as hiring practices, what we're trying to build here is a kind of a Mayo Clinic for data. So we want to be the vendor of choice for the world's most valuable systems, but we want to be the employer of choice for the world's leading minds in the field, and kind of triangulate those two populations. And we are now active in 26 countries, even in Canada, where we are headquartered and have the main body of our workforce. A solid third to a half of those were born outside Canada and were attracted to the opportunity to come here, in part because of our immigration policies and dynamics. So from a hiring practices point of view, I guess the easiest way to say is that we're trying to attract the best minds in the field, period. And as a result, we've kind of had to abandon Canadian experience as a proxy for competence quite early. And so we have a lot of practice, and that's what I guess I can bring to the conversation.
Thank you both. It's very interesting. You're both internationally focused, not just nationally focused, and yet you occupy two very different domains. I would think that Denton's and law is an old, not old in age, but old in history. It's an old storied profession. And Pythian is a new kind of world, open to the new world with technology and data and all of that. So we've got a bit of the North and the South Pole, and we're all hopefully meeting on this agenda. So now, specifically, as employers, what is your reaction to the new OHRC policy? Paul, over to you first.
Well, my first reaction was that I was kind of surprised that it was allowed before. Honestly, I personally think that using something that is so exclusive as a way to welcome new immigrants into our country, the very first thing that the average employer might say to them is, so tell me what experience you already have here. At the exact moment when they're trying to gain their very first experience here, it turns my stomach, to be honest. So I think it's long overdue. That's my initial reaction.
And yours, Michael?
Ratna, I would, first of all, let me just go back to something Paul said a minute ago. For us, like at Pythian, for us at Denton's, the attraction of talent is the most important thing in all of those categories I mentioned, whether they're regulated or non-regulated. And so for years now, we have been immersed in a very robust diversity and inclusion program. We've achieved Best Employer for New Canadian Awards, for which we are very proud. Mm-hmm. And so hearing about this new policy, I must confess, I'm a commercial litigator. I run our litigation group here in Toronto. I too was a bit surprised actually that it was in fact necessary to promulgate this, because for us here at Denton's, it's a complete non-event. We're looking for folks with relevant experience and people who are legally entitled to work in Canada. There may be regulatory exceptions. For example, right now we have a person who is trained as a lawyer in Ireland who has just finished writing his bar exams in Ontario. So he obviously can't practice at Denton's as a lawyer in Ontario, but we saw talent in him, and he is working currently in our knowledge management group because he has what it takes to succeed, we believe. And there are many other examples like that in our firm.
So that's interesting. Both of you are surprised that, in fact, we needed this policy, and yet we do know that some employers, according to Barbara, are still asking for it. So let's delve into this a little further. I would encourage everyone to start thinking about their questions. As I said, don't worry about getting them grammatically right. We are not publishing a thesis. We're just having a chat. And there has been a request for speakers to speak up, and so do speak into the phones as much as you can, Barbara, Paul, and Michael. So my next question is, let's delve into some more specifics about your practices in recruitment and assessment. So perhaps you could give us a sense, Michael, of what strategies, techniques you use to assess a candidate's ability to do the job.
I'm happy to do that, and I hope people can hear me because I'm almost sitting on my phone here. We do behavioral and situational interviews. And we have a template because we want things to be consistent, and we ask role-related technical questions, again, having regard to the specific job that's in question. You'll remember the list I gave you earlier. So for each of the different areas, we have a standardized and consistent approach. We also, in certain roles, have testing. Our legal administrative assistants have to do typing speed, accuracy, attention to detail, data entry, Microsoft, et cetera, and that allows us to assess candidates on the merits, and the merits are the most important thing, obviously.
Okay, so you said you had a template. Let me ask you a question, Michael. Is it possible for you to share the template with us, and then then we share it with everybody else? Can you check into that? Is that at all a possibility?
I will certainly check into it. It is, of course, kept by our HR people, but I'm happy to look into that, and if we can share it, we'll share it happily.
That would be a wonderful unintended outcome of this conversation. So over to you, Paul. How do you assess a candidate's ability to do the job?
Well, the first insight I would bring is that I think that the average employer really underinvests in the exercise of evaluating a candidate. And just to illustrate that, from my point of view, when I was shopping for my house, I must have spent 30 or 50 hours looking at different houses and figuring out how I was going to finance it. And that's for a mortgage that cost me, what, $2,000 or $3,000 a month. $2,000 or $3,000 a month doesn't even buy you an entry-level employee. And yet, who is really spending 30 or 50 hours evaluating that person in the way that you would for a similar spend personally? So I just think that the ROI on making a larger upfront investment is very, very obvious to me, and we make that kind of investment. We start with every candidate. We do about a half day's work simulation. We've automated that to the degree possible. It takes a half day for the candidate. It doesn't take a half day for us, obviously. But we focus on work simulation primarily because we've realized that all of the proxies for capability and competency and productivity, they tend to misfire far too often. And if you think about it, Canadian experience is a proxy. It's just like seeing a job on a resume. Seeing a job on a resume that somebody held for 3 years is a proxy for them knowing how to do that job. I find that the best practice is all about testing that they actually know how to do the job, especially in a way that you design to verify that this is the job that you want. So, create a pretend customer. Create a pretend user and teach them what their job is, and then make them available for questions, and then assign your candidate a task, and then let them ask your pretend customer how to handle the situation, and see what they actually do, and let your pretend customer, your pretend user score them. And that is a way of eliminating this proxyism, which I think is at the heart of the matter in terms of the Canadian experience requirement. So, I mean, after the half day's work simulation, we have a score. We definitely go through a fit exercise. If the language skills are in question, we may have third-party language testing. I don't think language requirements are the slightest bit problematic. I think that different jobs have different language competency requirements. But, there are many third-party testing outfits that can help quantify someone's language skills if they are in question. And it's much healthier for us to quantify them that way.
Well, you've just given me an idea for our next webinar, which should be on simulation. I think that's actually a wonderful technique and probably not well understood and something we could do. But moving on to our next question, because time is tight, and I promised the audience lots and lots of time for their questions. So I want to go back to Barbara, and if Barbara can, because what moves the world is sometimes not the legal frameworks, but the practical examples one can borrow from and emulate. So I'm wondering, Barbara, if you can provide us with one best practice that an employer uses during the assessment and recruitment process, and one best practice that a regulatory body uses.
Well, I'll start with one that both could make sure was in place, and that was that all the staff who are working with hiring have been trained in human rights and cultural competence, so that they are coming to the task with open minds and understanding of what needs to be done. In terms of employers, it's always one, it's hard to think of one, but one that would jump out would be considering having periods when on-the-job training, supports, and resources that will help people succeed, and then potential probationary periods, paid internships, short contracts at the beginning to give applicants the opportunity to actually prove their skills. And that's a good practice, whether one's dealing with people who have or don't have Canadian experience. In terms of regulatory bodies, it's really coming to the question with a mindset that experience gained elsewhere is not inferior or substandard to Canadian experience. It really is, it goes back to the cultural competency of understanding difference but also commonality, and not applying judgments to based on where things come from.
Great. So one last question to our panelists before we open it up to the floor, which is, the floor is quite noisy, I will tell you. Lots of chatter going on. That's wonderful. So Paul and Michael, can you provide us with one or two tips on how we can improve bias-free assessment and hiring?
If you'd like me to go first, it's Michael. I'm happy to do that. There's really two components to this succeeding. The first is having a robust hiring policy and actually writing down a standardized interview process, including with vetted questions, and having a consistency of interviewing practices, so that if you have a team of interviewers, which we often do, the types of questions that are going to be asked are substantially similar. So that's the first part. The other part has to do with your approach to it. And we have gone through training, actually, and we continue to go through training so that people are aware of cultural differences. And so what that results in is an open-minded interview process, one where folks are not judgmental, and they take a, quote, outside of North America approach. And if I can just say this one thing, I noticed a chat about, us being an international firm, although we like to use the term global. What I have said earlier applies to a smaller local business equally. All of the things that we practice are, in fact, the very things that we practice when we are recruiting people in the Toronto office, or in the Edmonton office, or in the Ottawa office. So these bigger policies are actually localized, but they're consistent across the board. A couple of specific examples that we try to impress upon people. We all like to talk about the Maple Leafs, how great they are, the best hockey team in the world and all of that, or maybe the Toronto Argos or Toronto Football Club. Those types of jokes might not work, or those types of references might not work, depending on the cultural background of a candidate. And so we just avoid that. Asking somebody to take their jacket off, you avoid that because you might be making that person feel uncomfortable when that was not the intention. And that is part of the cultural training that I was referring to earlier. We try to help people understand that we need to think outside of our so-called North American culture when we're going through these processes.
That's excellent. I hadn't thought about the jacket one, so I learned something too. I mean, always learn something, but that was interesting. So over to you, Paul.
Well, I mean, I don't want to seem, by comparison to Michael, cold or crass to the immigrant experience. But at the same time, I don't think it's inappropriate for us to be concerned that whether our candidates understand our industry landscape, which was the #1 survey response. I think an understanding of our industry landscape and how to be successful, it actually matters very much. And so, I mean, if someone were particularly concerned by a suggestion that they take off their jacket, it might actually give me pause. And again, it would be actual evidence that this person might not be comfortable in a normal Canadian business situation. And I don't know if it's our job as employers selecting new candidates to take on ownership of helping them become comfortable. I think our job is to evaluate them based on their actual likelihood of success at succeeding in our workload. And so I agree that bias-free hiring practices are extremely important. I just think that bias-free doesn't mean don't measure their ability to succeed in your workplace.
That's an interesting
If I could just say something though, Ratna, just to,
of course, Michael.
Not to get into an argument with my friend Paul, but that person who might be asked to take their jacket off in a very innocuous way might be one of the most talented people you've ever met. And I think one needs to be very careful about what is the industry that you're talking about. And I think we need to keep an open mind about the North American business is no longer just the North American business.
Yes, so now we're at the heart of the matter. Good way to tie that back together, Michael. Go on.
So I would say, yeah, I agree. At the end of the day, common sense has to prevail. But for those people that are involved in the hiring process, if they have a little box around them that just says, here's how we do things in Canada, and so when we interview somebody who's not from Canada, we're going to just drop all of our cultural expectations on that person and assume that they will just seamlessly adopt that cultural change in the course of 1 or 2 interviews. We need to be careful because you can potentially miss talent if you misstep in a small way like that.
Mm-hmm.
Wonderful.
Just to reinforce what Michael is saying, the first job simulation interview that we do the exact same job simulation interview for any candidate, whether they happen to be in India or in Costa Rica or in Ottawa. The same exact job simulation interview, and it's done completely remotely, and it doesn't rely heavily on language skills, cultural skills, or so on. It's purely a technical deliverable that's needed, and we interact with them as they go about achieving it. The kind of candidate that Michael described would stand out in that kind of a technical assessment. And it's important to remember that everyone comes to you as a package with a mix of strengths and weaknesses, you and I included. I mean, ask any of my close collaborators if I'm good at everything. Of course not. I'm awful at some things, just literally need my colleagues and my support. An important job that we do here is we make sure to blend a mix of outstanding technical skills with a mix of outstanding social or communication or EQ skills in a team that then has a competency that outstrips that of any individual contributor. And so that's an important dynamic here, is to recognize that an applicant for an opening is bringing a hodgepodge mix of skills and weaknesses to you, and that's true for every applicant, whether they're from Canada or not, whether it's their first job in Canada or not. And it's important for us to see hiring as kind of being the blend master, right? How much Robusto, how much Arabica, and deciding.
That's wonderful. I love this back and forth, but we are now going to open it up to floor, and I would ask the participants to type their questions in the box, and time permitting, we will answer all of them. But I am going to respond to some chatter in the box, which I tend to agree with. It seems to us and to many of the participants that we're speaking to a small group of the converted. So my challenge back to you is, how do we reach? How does Allies, how does Matri, how does OHRC, how do we all who are in this group of converted, how do we reach other people, other employers, And so I would love to get your ideas on that. So there is a first question, which is an excellent question. It comes from Avril, and it talks about, the question is, most of our comments have been around interviewing. What happens to people who actually don't even get screened in to the interviewing process? They are screened out because their education is from a different place or a different country, or their names are strange sounding, etc., etc. And there is research to back up the conclusion that strange sounding names like mine will have a bigger challenge in getting into the interview room than others whose name is, let's say, Michael Schaeffler. So who'd like to take that question? This is pre-interview. This is all about looking at the paper that comes to you raw in terms of applications for jobs.
It's Barbara here. I'm happy to start on that one. A big question that we get asked a lot. If there are sectors of the economy or organizations where there seem to be indicators that certain groups of people are not being considered and are being filed in, or their applications are going into the bin because of grounds protected under the code, so going back to ethnic origin, place of origin, race, etc., then it is possible to for the Commission to approach them, to file complaints, and the issue becomes one of how you prove that discrimination has occurred. And sometimes that can be done by looking at the data. Who works there? How does that correspond to the likely applicants or the makeup of the community around it? So there can be systemic issues like that, and while they're challenging, they are issues that we're always grappling with, and Canadian experience came out of those things we were hearing. That's why we came up with the policy.
Excellent. So here's an interesting question. Thank you, Tarsi. So this is for Paul and Michael, this goes to the tricky question of remuneration. So if you are looking for talent, regardless of where it comes from, and you're testing for competencies, does your remuneration does your remuneration take the experience that people have gained somewhere else into account as well? Does that play into the mix?
Can I take this one, Barbara?
Certainly.
Or Ratna?
Yes, absolutely.
So, for me, the way that I approach remuneration is, I think, a little bit controversial, and if not controversial, at least atypical. But we don't really have much in the way of bands for salaries and so on here at Pythian. What we do instead is, much like you would, back to the shopping for a house analogy, you would never visit a house that's way out of your budget, right? And the very first piece of data that you gather when deciding what houses to visit is, what do they cost? So we take that approach. We allow every candidate to tell us, okay, so what is your asking salary? And it won't be negotiated. Whatever it is that your asking salary is, that's the very first question that we ask them before we even spend very much time after screening them into the selection process. They get to set it. If they say 50,000, if they say 80,000, if they say 150,000, it's not a problem, whatever it is that they say. But then we evaluate them against their anticipated remuneration, and we select the best candidate. Now, the best candidate is the one that meets all the expectations and ultimately offers us the most amazing deal. And so this is a very immigrant-friendly strategy, in the sense that many people who are looking for their very first job in Canada have very modest expectations for their very first salary, but with an expectation that after 3 years of being amazing at a workload, they're going to have the negotiating power or the ability to move from one job to another and resolve that. And so it really allows them to bootstrap their career in Canada. And to me, if someone were to say to me, hey, I have this level of seniority, this competency, and yeah, maybe I have an accent, but my language skills are absolutely amazing, and my educational background, maybe you don't know it too much, but go ahead and test me, and I'll kick ass in the test, and I'm willing to work for $20,000 less than the other guy, you're hired, and I don't mind. And within a year, that person has gotten the raise and is making market. And so, to me, finding a way to elbow your way into an employer with the wherewithal that you have is, I think, it's almost a human right. And so, we just take care of salary in the very first conversation, and then the remuneration that people earn, the job offer that they get, is exactly the number that they requested. And if they win their way into the opening, wonderful. But this is the kind of hiring policy that led to us having, I believe it's somewhere between 35 and 40% of people working here were not educated or born in Canada. And that's Canadians working here. I mean, our headcount is almost half international, so that's just of the people in Canada.
That's a really interesting compensation approach, and that's a topic for another webinar. I have lots of questions coming in, but I want to thank Anita for her Anita Shivnath for her comments about how Matri and Allies can work with bringing our content to the people who are not converted, not the usual suspects. But here's a very interesting question, Barbara, for you. There are circumstances where candidates will require knowledge and experience working with specific legislative instruments and tools that are specific to Canadian jurisdiction. So, for example, caseworkers someone wants to be a social worker may need to have experience working with Ontario works legislation. Someone wanting to be licensed as an engineer may need to have an understanding or knowledge of the Ontario Building Code, etc., etc. How do you, is that part of the, how would you respond to that? Is that not a valid requirement for employment in certain occupations?
Those are valid requirements. So put them in as requirements, not saying Canadian experience, but rather knowledge of certain legislation. I mean, that can be obtained in a number of ways. I'm a lawyer. I know that if you're going to practice law in a particular jurisdiction, you need to understand the laws. You can study that from afar, or you can study that here without having Canadian experience. The question is, whether you're given an opportunity to show or to establish your knowledge in that area. It's perfectly fine to request it, but give people the opportunity to show that they have the knowledge and competence you need.
That's perfect. So be explicit instead of quoting your requirements in code. That's actually a very, very good answer. Thank you, Barbara. I will keep that in mind too, because I get challenged often about these things as well. So I have a question for Michael. I'm thinking this is a good question for Michael because as a lawyer, you must be dealing with organizations of all sizes. And the question is about small and medium-sized businesses that do not have a lot of resources to implement HR practices such as, you know, the template that you talked about. So what would you say to a medium-sized business, let's say someone with 100 to 120 employees? How should they refresh and renew their hiring practices without having to spend a lot of money on that?
Well, let me put on my litigator's hat first, and litigation is about risk management. So the first thing I would say, even to the smaller businesses, is that you have to get with the times. And if you're offside, you know, you're going to pay the price in terms of risk management. So this is not an optional thing. You just have to do it. Now, there has to be proportionality in how you go about doing the right thing, of course. And one of the great ways to do that is to tap into existing networks of trade associations, personal relationships, people, if you know people in the HR world, HR lawyers even. Lawyers can help sometimes. I think that's the way word of mouth is important. Attending these kinds of webinars seems to me like a fairly efficient way to learn a lot about what's going on. So I think those are some of the basic pieces of advice I would give to our audience.
That is very good. And Paul, as a small, you are an SME or an M or an S, I don't know. What would you tell your colleagues?
I'm not sure I really have a lot to add to what Michael just said. And in the interest of time, I mean, not sure I have anything really intelligent to amplify there.
That's fair. I have another question, and I think this is primarily for you, Michael, and for you, Barbara. Do you have any recommendations for regulatory bodies evaluating knowledge of local codes, standards, safety practices? In the absence of Canadian work experience, would competency testing, examination, coursework, provisional licensure, etc., be a preferred option? I think this is a leading question, but still I'll put it out to you. It's from Jillian Pischler, if I can pronounce that right.
That's a good question. I'm not entirely certain that applies. Now, if you're dealing with let's take the example of a foreign-trained lawyer, and not to bore those that don't deal with that, but becoming a lawyer in Ontario is quite difficult to begin with. When you have a foreign legal license, let's say my coworker from Ireland that I mentioned earlier. So he's trained in Ireland. He comes over to Canada. His first point of contact in terms of trying to get qualified is through the Federation of Law Societies, and in Ontario that would be the Law Society of Upper Canada, that has guidelines as to what needs to be done first to test that person for competency. And they go through a battery of tests, and you are then ultimately told, here are the topics that we think we need to examine you on so that you can come into Ontario with the equivalent of an LLB. So that's step one. Step two then is you need to do your articles, and typically in Ontario nowadays you article for about 10 months. But depending on your background, again, that can be abridged. And then finally you have to write your bar exams, and those are fairly standard barristers and solicitors exams. So that's the lawyer's perspective.
It is different for different occupations and sectors, but I think what you're describing is pretty standard. I think I have heard of provisional licenses in certain regulated occupations. Maybe we can get back to that question later. Barbara, there's some curiosity in whether you are in Vancouver because the BC Human Rights Commission is interested in this policy, or other provinces are interested in this policy, or even the federal government. Can we get some indication from you whether there is possibility of the OHRC's lead in Canadian work experience being emulated by other jurisdictions?
I'm actually in Vancouver for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission work on residential schools, but I can tell you that the other commissions in Canada, both the Canadian, the national one, and the provincial and territorial commissions, are all very interested in the work that Ontario has done on this issue. And we work closely with other commissions. We're one of the bigger ones, and so sometimes we're able to do policy work that others don't have the resources to do. And often when we put out policies, they're picked up by other commissions who basically adjust them to the whatever peculiarities or differences there are in legislation. But I think that this may well be something that others will focus on, because we hear so strongly and consistently from newcomers what a barrier this is. After they come to Canada excited about using their skills and experience, and end up with doors being closed.
So I have a final question, and this is more, I don't know if anyone can answer it, but it's a question worth asking. Should employers, or have employers in a sector use their authority or their influence to influence regulatory bodies and their view on Canadian work experience? Do we know of an instance where, let's say, a sector has said to their regulator, our need is so great for talent that, and you're blocking the talent pipeline to change your requirements? I don't know if anyone's able to answer that, and if I hear silence, I will assume that this is a question we should try and answer and come back to the group with. So I'm going to say 1, 2.
Ratna?
Yes.
Mike, I do. Let me first say that I'm not aware of any official such activity, but I think it's important to keep in mind that certainly in our sector, and I would expect that to be repeated in other sectors, we do keep an informal line with our regulatory body, in this case the Law Society of Upper Canada. And so there is feedback from time to time, for example, with respect to the requirements for foreign-trained lawyers to become accredited and licensed in Ontario. So in that respect, it does work. We also, I personally have been involved in some legislative committee work where, and I won't say who, but people were advocating against certain proposed legislative changes that would have made it difficult for a member of a particular regulated profession to come and practice that particular trade in Ontario. And I am aware that ultimately that legislation was, the draft was altered. So I'm not saying it's a perfect system, but those of us that are tuned into these particular issues and that do want to make a difference certainly have the ability to speak up and to do it.
I think that was a good insight into what can be possible and what may be possible.
Ratna?
Yes.
It's Barbara.
Yes.
I don't have knowledge of an example with a regulatory body, but I have been told by people in Saskatchewan that when unemployment was high and there was a large employee pool, people often asked for Canadian experience. As unemployment dropped to a very low level and there were fewer employees available, the Canadian experience requirement was less frequently applied, and that many employers were very excited to see that there was a much bigger, more interesting, more talented pool to hire from, and that changed the attitudes that had previously resulted in barriers. So it is about people learning that, in fact, there's benefit for professions, for employers to have the largest pool possible to choose from.
So, goes back to the classic context of supply and demand. So on that note, thank you all. Unfortunately, our time is really running out. I want to really commend first our three panelists for being so generous with their comments and explanations and examples. I also want to thank the audience. I mean, there have been some fantastic links and resources posted and some good, and I take this really sincerely. Clearly, Maitri has to do a better job of reaching out to the unusual suspects through trade associations, etc. But frankly, I also do want to share with you, we have tried and tried again. We need also to find new ways to bring them into our into these discussions, and I'm at a little bit of a loss of where to go next. So any ideas are appreciated. So thank you, Barbara, for a solid overview of the Commission's policy on Canadian experience. Thank you to Michael and of Denton's. And by the way, there's some wonderful resources both from Denton's and from Pythian's posted online and at Higher Immigrants. Both of you have provided great insight into what you do and what others, therefore, can easily do. Thank you to our audience, a fantastic, brilliant audience of very large numbers. I can't even see on the computer how many. This webinar has been recorded and will be available shortly, along with past webinars on things like religious accommodation, etc., etc. In addition, Higher Immigrants has a lot of resources, good ideas, tips, tools. So if you're an employer looking for an easy-to-take idea, we're your go-to site. And do sign up for e-tips. And finally, we will be sending you out a survey shortly. Do fill it out and tell us how you think we did. Thank you again, and see you all at our next webinar. Enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.